Are they?
Let's take a few questions. Khadr?
Okay, since you, Emile, and I also product of the Shamash system, at least in its smaller form, one of the things that Emile mentioned, and I think you omitted from that when you described that the religious community was against and the liberal moved, is actually the crucial role of Rabbi Abdullah Somech. He was the top authority of halakha, and he is the one who actually went to the Alliance school, talked to the teacher, sat down in the class, and he returned, sending his son to the school. And that actually finished all the objection of the religious, the other rabbis. The same thing he has repeated when the Alliance School for Girls opened. So this time, again, he went to the school, and what he didn't say anything. He sent his granddaughter to the school. And that was very important. Without the blessing of Rabbi Abdullah Somech, I don't think it would have been as easy as you described it.
Okay, thank you. Thabit?
Thank you. I have two questions for Orit. First, concerning the education in Iraq, about the Hadithat Karbala, the massacre of. It was never ever taught, even under the Ottomans, and certainly under the monarchy, was never taught that the Umayyad army was defeating a rebellion. Even the Sunni establishment taught it in Iraq as a very unjust, massacre of the grandson of the Prophet, and that Yazid was not really a good Muslim, etc. So even from the Sunni perspective, that was dominant in the educational establishment in Iraq, even under the Ottomans. They were very careful to deal with this in a way that would placate Shia sensibility. So I just want to mention that. But my other comment is about, in general, your talk. Aren't we at the risk? Of course, we want to deal with the issue of Jewish-Muslim relations as a counter to a predominant narrative that, they were always horrible, etc. But aren't we at the risk of going in the other extreme, of trying to show as if it was idealistic and there was always wonderful relations, etc.? I say this because, I'm not Jewish, but I'm also a member of a minority. And in Iraq, the issue that you mentioned, that under Shia custom and laws, that they would not eat from the same plate or touch, etc., this was unbelievably hurtful. And it was very deep. I remember my grandmother, for example, saying that we never forgave them for treating us this way. So I just want to sort of lay that out, that perhaps we're going a bit too far, that there were real tensions, there were real suspicions, and even hatreds, especially when you go further away from the educated classes. If you go into the countryside, where my grandparents grew up, they weren't always so idyllic, the relations. It was very suspicious, very tense. There were moments of real anger.
We'll take two more questions before we address. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Very exciting panel. I'm just going to actually sort of tackle what Dr. Abdullah was saying, but we do have examples of Jewish community joining in Husseyniyat and actually joining in grieving ceremonies. So I would call it latmiyat, yani. So I think we're not necessarily celebrating this moment as this, to describe Iraq in general, but it's really interesting to highlight those unique moments of interaction, especially in moments of grief when communities come together, and it's Jewish women coming into the houses of Shia and grieving with them on a professional level. And I'm just wondering if Dr. Bashkin came across that in her research. And just a quick mention to Sarah, I noticed that you put up Amir Elias Hospital, a picture of the Amir Elias Hospital, and I'm wondering if you have come across any Iraqi doctors going to France to work rather than the other way around. And regarding the Geneva doctors being, the German doctors, German Jewish doctors fleeing Nazi persecution, there was a deliberate effort by the Iraqi embassy in London to deliver their files to Baghdad, and they did reach Baghdad. However, the two people that blocked that process was the architects of the medical college. They deliberately prevented the hiring of those doctors, and they stated that the Anglo-Iraqi treaty is the reason why we can't hire them, because we have to hire British doctors instead. So I'm just wondering if you've come across Iraqi doctors leaving Iraq for that.
One more, and then we'll address it. Yeah, Tom.
I have a question for Sasha. First of all, I really enjoyed your presentation, and I just recall seeing a lot of references in 19th century Arabic journals to the Rothschilds and to sort of some of the things that you discussed, the Damascus affair. And I'm just wondering about, you mentioned that there is a shift from the 19th to the 20th century in terms of Iraqi Jewish perceptions of these European-based Jewish organizations. I was wondering if you could say just a little bit more about the 19th century context. From what I've seen, the Arab elites who were publishing journals were actually aware of European Jewish philanthropic activity and interested in it as well.
Okay, hold on. Emile, do you want to answer?
Okay. Regarding the one by Khadr, I didn't mention that because of the time that's allotted to the lecture. I mean, it is, I think you may have come across it in detail in the lecture I had done previously on the Alliance. I mentioned the role of Abdallah Sumekh and all the intrigues that took place. As far as this presentation is concerned, it's really leading towards the contribution of the Jews in Iraq. So going into that much detail would not be helpful, I think. The object is achieved, which is that the Jews obtained high education, which contributed in the process to the building of the nation. I don't think there's another question for me.
Okay. So to answer the question first about Mir Elias Hospital and doctors training, we do know that Iraqi Jews go primarily to London for medical training, and actually in 1938, I think it is, there's a bequest set up by a man named H.E. David to train Iraqi students, primarily in Europe, and then with the idea that they will then come back to Iraq and help the nation, right? But because of World War II and then the subsequent events after World War II, I haven't found any records that any of those students ever go back. But there are many students who are sent to Europe. The majority do not come back. In fact, I haven't really found examples. I think I found examples of nurses who have been sent to Europe, but not doctors. So I hope that answers your question. And then you're right, the comment about the doctors, you fleshed it out a little bit more than the information I had, but my point in my piece was really that they're very much conscious of this, and they're trying to assist their co-religionists. Ultimately, some German doctors, and I think one or two Austrian, they make it to Baghdad, but Baghdad not as a permanent point for the most part, but then going on to India. And then we see articles in the Baghdadi English press in India that discuss, we're welcoming these doctors, they're setting up office hours, please support them and help them out.
Rosenfeld.
Right, yeah,
Rosenfeld
yeah.
is a great name.
Okay, now on to Lital's question. Certainly in the 19th century, and this is maybe when you try to pack too much into a paper, Baghdadi elites are very much aware of the Haskalah, very much aware of philanthropic events. I mean, that's the Baghdadi, well, the community does write to the Alliance, and they participate in Hebrew language Haskalah press. My point was more so that because of the success of these transnational networks and the flourishing of education in Iraq, this really picks up and multiplies in the 20th century, and also that these periodicals are much more prevalent amongst a larger portion of the society. So it's there, it's very well documented in your work, in Orit Bashkin's work, but it doesn't go away. It actually multiplies, and you see new and different debates in the early, mid-20th century, which are pose actually very interesting and sophisticated questions about religious reform, for example. So that's the answer. Thank you.
Yeah, so to Thabit's point, thank you for that. So I'll start with the teaching of Hussein and the martyrdom of Hussein. So while there were definitely attempts to make there wasn't any attempt to glorify Yazid, who was in charge, and actually in many Muslim countries, including Sunni countries, the martyrdom of Hussein is mentioned. You can read Naguib Mahfouz, the Thulatiyya, and how in Gamaliya in Egypt, there's they love Hussein. And in Iraq itself, you had other versions of this in kind of a modern form. So for example, people read Georgi Zaidan's novel about Hussein. It was called, I think, The Maidens of Karbala or something like that. So there's definitely kind of an adaptation of a little bit. But the sectarian nature of Iraqi society does pop up. So for example, in the late 1920s, they tried to bring a book from Syria about the Umayyads, written by Anis al-Nusuli. And there are strong demonstrations by the Shia community sort of saying, let's block the book. And then there's a whole debate in Iraq, what is, the freedom of expression and academic freedom and issues of that type. And I think in general, like a lot of scholars like Ernest Sidon and others sort of said, well, the period of the Islamic conquest, the Futuhat, that was everything that people learned about because it had all these amazing conquerors. But it's also true that it's a period that is very difficult to teach because all these sectarian differences come sort of materialize in such a dominant fashion. So I think, yes, there is an attempt to create a unified narrative. It's not only the Iraqi state, and it definitely builds on sort of Arab and Islamic cultures, but at the same time, it does come with certain amounts of problems. And you see this also in writings of travelers. So for example, Akram Zuaitar, who's a very important Palestinian writer, says, I go to Najaf and Karbala, and, they curse the Umayyads and they curse Omar. And so there are these tensions that I don't think disappear. There are definitely, the state finds venues to deal with them. Now, your other question is something that I've been thinking a lot about. And, when I wrote this article, if whether a writing of this kind is a sectarian act, so now I will write the history of Iraqi Jews and the Sunnis, Iraqi Jews and the Shiites, Iraqi Jews and the Christians. But I think that talking a little bit about, my aim was more to sort of point out that it's not just a Baghdadi experience and the contexts are different. In terms of, romanticizing this relationship, I don't take lightly the effect of people not touching one another. And in fact, it appears all over the travel literature. And the first time that I encountered that was actually I interviewed a communist, a Jewish communist, and he said, the thing that pushed me to the Communist Party was that, a neighbor incidentally touched me, and then he felt like he was contaminated, and that was the way that pushed me to the party. But I wanted sort of to present sort of a counter narrative. And yeah, I hope that in the larger version of this paper, it's not too romanticized that everybody cried for Hussein and everything was perfect. But I think, especially given, this kind of argument that Jews were, as I've mentioned at the end, the Jews were only into foreign trade and they were just aiming to Britain and they were not thinking locally. And again, the fact that it's not necessarily an equal relationship, but when you have landowners and people living in neighborhoods, and I was thinking about Pele's talk, when those guys go to the casinos and where the dancers are and when the singers are, I don't think that they're thinking who's washing the dishes and who prepared the plates. So it's also different context, but I don't want to diminish these experiences, but there are other experiences that make them more complicated. So I guess that will be an intervention in a more refined version of this.
Okay, we'll take more questions.
I actually have a question for Hanaw. In terms of your quarter, how many people were aware who are there now that it's a Jewish sort of quarter before? And if they weren't, when you told them, what were their reactions?
Actually, right now there are not any Jewish in Kurdistan, in Suleimania, but as Jeffrey Khan mentioned, there are Jewish in other parts of Kurdistan. So, but when it was really challenging when I got the reaction from other respondents from, the Julakan neighborhood. They were friends and still they really, I met some people, even they cried. So there were lots of emotions about how they loved their neighbors, but they were hopeless.
Yeah, sorry, the mic is
Oh, thank you. First of all, could I just quickly say to Sasha about the students who didn't come back from the UK? The Iraqi government summoned back its citizens from the UK in 1940-41. The first ship did make it back. This included students. The second ship, the Al-Awaki, which our father was on, was sunk by a German U-boat, and so those students did not make it back. And it became impossible for them to travel back to Iraq. Actually, when our father did go back to Mosul, where he came from, in 1946, his father said to him he had to go back to England because there was no future for the Jews in Iraq. That was 1946. But also thinking about Mosul, and I think this question is for anybody on the panel who wants to answer it. The Jewish community in Mosul was really a small community, really a small minority. And we have heard a lot about Baghdadi Jews, and mostly when Iraqi Jews are discussed, it's really mainly Baghdadi Jews who are being discussed. And yes, although the Jews were a small minority of the Iraqi population as a whole, in Baghdad they were not such a small minority. And I think that makes a really big difference. And I think it makes a difference in terms of their interactions with all the other communities that they were engaged with in various different ways, and the extent to which they felt vulnerable, but also the educational opportunities were very different in different parts of the country. So I think the kind of, both the interactions and the sort of areas of difference are not the same in different parts of the country, and I think that also relates to the size of the minority. It's a really big difference if your minority is like a third or more of the population of the city, or if it's a really tiny amount. So I wonder whether, it may be particularly relevant to Kurdistan, but also to Orit's work, I know, and to the extent to which you feel that when you are sort of discussing the changes that the community goes through in relation to this overarching theme of modernity, it really does make a difference whether you are part of quite a large minority or part of really quite a small minority.
I'm not having a question. I'm going to answer a question that posed by one of the speakers regarding the education of the Iraqi Jews. I think it was it works both directions. It helped them to succeed and to hold positions, and it raised the envy of the population. We know the envy, from school. They used to tell us, أنت يهودي ذكي, you're Jewish, you're clever. And then followed by ضفرة وشلاق أو لطمة, by hitting. And then there is a religion factor. According to teaching of the Islam, Jewish person cannot have an authority above Muslims. I know in history, at least one example that one Muslim kingdom went to war against another Muslim kingdom because they appointed Jewish wazir. And the third influence was the Nazi propaganda, and Haj Amin al-Husseini in the 30s, they started to incite against the Jews.
Thank you. I was thinking about the thoughts Emile left us with, about the curse. Old women these days and before, they tell us, it's Hobat Lihud. What we done to the Jews, this is the curse of what's happening in Iraq for a long time now. Always, it is Hobat Lihud, because that's what we done to innocent people. But we shouldn't forget the influence of the German embassy in the 30s on Iraqi army officers with their lavish parties, with beautiful German girls for every officer. And that also brings us to something which is maybe it needs a research. If you look at the photos of men in the 30s in Iraq, most of them have a Hitler-style mustache. Just because Hitler against the British who occupied Iraq. Later on, when Hitler lost, most of them came up with a Stalinist mustache. And I have photos in my family, Hitler design and Stalinist design. And that really, I think it needs research, that how these photos shows what politics can do to the people.
Saddam at the Ba'athist later on.
Then even with the Ba'athist, you know why they use the Ba'athist style mustache? It's like 8, because 8 of Shabbat, April, when they took over. So Ba'athi must have a style, Ba'athist style mustache. That shows how very important this is to research the photos and the mustache. But a very main important thing to understand, of course, politics ruin everything, but we need to understand the difference between one of the main difference between Sunni and Shia when politics wasn't, involved. These days we know Shia is Iran Shia, Iran-style Shia, and of course Hezbollah, and of course all this extremist way of understanding Shiism. Shia, in origin, the main difference is that they accept any ruler. That's the main difference between Sunni and Shia. Shia accept any ruler, even if he is atheist, but he must be just. While the Sunni, the ruler must be a Muslim, doesn't matter if he is just or not. And that big difference between the, for that we can see the dictators of the Arab world. Thank you.
We'll take one question and then.
Thank you so much about also the wonderful papers. Regarding to Professor Orit Bashkin, which is, I cited her a lot also in my paper. Ahmed Sousa, you mentioned Ahmed Sousa, and a very funny story about when Ahmed Sousa converted to Islam, he went to Al-Azhar in 1930, I think 32 or 36. And then when he returned back, so basically the whole community of Hilla, the Shia, they took him to Najaf. So last year, a student, he did his dissertation in Baghdad about the Ahmed Sousa, his contribution, studying theology, because the most important books about the history of, the old history about Iraqi Jew, written according to my reading, by Ahmed Sousa. So, and the university, his supervisor, he asked him, we need to know if Ahmed, first of all, they said, you have to choose another topic. You left everyone and you came to this Jew? Although Ahmed Sousa, he converted to Islam, say 60, 70 years ago, and then he faced also this issue with the supervisor. He said, we want to know, he is Shia or Sunni? So the sectarian, notion is still, even after the fall of the dictatorship and other things about the Kurdish Jews. You mentioned, I do agree with you about the hierarchy of the narratives, because since yesterday we're focusing on Arab Jew or Iraqi Jews, but I didn't hear anything about the wave of immigration from Jazeera al-Arabiya, from Najd and Hijaz, during the first displacement by Umar ibn al-Khattab of Jews and Christians, and then they went and settled what's called now Anbar. So some of them, they went to Heat, and in Heat, the foundation of Qara'un, of Al-Qara'in, established there. So we didn't hear anything about also Heat. So.
Emile, do you want to?
Yeah, okay. I got comment on each one, but I don't know which one to start off, or shall I go through the lot, or one as subject at a time?
No,
Okay.
go ahead.
First, we talked about Mosul. Lady mentioned about the Jews in Mosul. There is a big difference between the Jews in Mosul and the Jews in Baghdad. Essentially, within Mosul, there is little education gap between Muslims, Christians, and Jews, unlike Baghdad. That's one thing. Second, the question we raised, the question of, call it, class struggle. The Jews in Mosul were not so rich. In fact, they were poor in comparison with the rest. Therefore, there wasn't that hostility towards them, and they were very well integrated, far better integrated than Baghdad, believe it or not. We come to the question that Nashi raised, how you were insulted. These things happen. These things happen to many minorities, many societies. There are odd ones. One mustn't take that. That's a general thing that it happens all the time. If you, it was mentioned yesterday, you take that book of Martin Gilbert, you will find every single incident. Maybe yours is in it. Otherwise, he must have missed it. He mentioned every single incident that happened throughout, I don't know how many centuries. Yeah. The position of the Dhimmis, you're absolutely right, and there were many cases in the past. The most famous is during the Abbasid period, Mutawakkil Billah made sure that the Jews ride on a donkey, would never ride on a horse. There are so many very detailed accounts of that, right? But that was followed in certain sections, if you like, certain dark periods of the Arab rules. It didn't happen all the way through. There were many times where it is quite the opposite.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
I take it now, I got one more, sorry, two more. Leah mentioned the question of the curse. The curse I was thinking of is a different one from the one you were on. I was talking about the curse on the Jews, not the other way around. And Emile mentioned the question of the Jews from Yemen and the Jazeera going to... We didn't mention that because that's not the subject. We didn't go into mentioning where did they come from, whether they came in from Nebuchadnezzar brought them on. This is all, we've gone past that. And the subject here is between 1920 and 1950. So I don't want to go back as far as 1,000 years ago.
Talking about the community in Heath, which is still, I visited Heath 2 months ago, and they are still Jews, of course they are converted to Islam, Sassoon family, and one of them, the most famous historian, Haji Najah Sassoon, is still there.
Well, I am sure there are plenty of Jews who got converted, plenty came in. Omar sent them to Kufa and Basra and things like that, and they converted, and they weren't any Jews anymore, in fact. 90,000 during Omar ibn al-Khattab was sent to Iraq.
I believe in such events like this, especially, is a good opportunity for Jewish people to introduce their identity, because you can't find such a great majority of people in everyday life. So, especially minorities in Iraq, they never mentioned and they were invisible. So. Most of you, you are from Baghdad. You lived in Baghdad. You have, you have contribution to knowledge about what happened in Baghdad. But for me, I don't know. I haven't seen, written works of any Jewish people regarding as a part of Iraq. So it's important to be mentioned, even if they are minorities or any other. It really shouldn't be missed out.
There are certainly many Iraqi Jews who are educated in Europe and come back. I was specifically discussing doctors who were part of a certain scheme for to receive scholarships to study in Europe. Was your father part of the H.E. David bequest scheme? Okay, and he went, but he didn't. His boat was sunk, you said. So there are some examples, but from what I've read, and again, this is really based on the Anglo-Jewish archives because they're trying to be sent back and they're being requested back. The records show that the students, again, on this specific scholarship, kind of disappear in that period because they don't want to go back. But of course, historically, many Iraqi students are sent to Europe and then come back and become teachers and pharmacists and do many things in Iraq. There's one very kind of interesting example. There's a girl who is sent in, I think it's 1939, to study at the Women's Teachers College at the Alliance Israélite Universelle. And then... There are three.
Girls, yeah.
There are 3 girls. Sam?
I know them personally.
You know the story.
Know them personally.
Okay. And well, so war breaks out in Paris, and they're evacuated to southern France, and they become part of the resistance, and they're stopped on. Well, I know what happens with one of them of the 3. Maybe all 3 this happens to, but they get stopped and by the Gestapo, and they think that they're going to be sent with the rest of the Jews, but because they're Iraqi citizens, they're released. And then they stay in hiding for the rest of the war, and when the war ends, they are sent via the JDC, the Joint, as Jewish refugees from World War II. So first they were as Iraqis, which is why they weren't arrested, as Jewish refugees to Palestine in 1946. And then from Palestine, because
Iraq.
yeah, because but they can't get back to Iraq because their passports have been expired. But Ibrahim Nahum, who is the Kaduri agent in Baghdad, happens to be in Palestine on business. And he's a member of parliament. He arranges for the passports to be renewed, and then they return to their families in Iraq. And then 2 or 3 years later, they go back, no longer mandate Palestine, but to the state of Israel. So there are lots of, I mean, just that's I think it's a very interesting story also in terms of different points in time, how people are perceived or ascribed to have different identities or nationalities. But certainly in the case of the doctors, at least, I haven't found any examples, but yes, there are people who go, there are people who come, and I think actually all of these micro histories are very interesting and certainly show the diversity of the Iraqi Jewish experience.
That's Flora, you know.
Yeah.
So regarding Ahmed Sousa, that's a very famous story of a Jew who was a man who was born as a Jew and later on converted to Islam. Now he published extensively and about sort of Iraqi agriculture. He had the PhD from Johns Hopkins. I was quoting from a book called في الطريق إلى الإسلام that was published in 1936. It's a very angry book. He's angry at the Jewish community for not allowing him to marry the woman he loves. He conflates Judaism and Zionism. And later on, over the years, he had more, let's say, especially his latest biography that he wrote in 84, 86, My Life is in Half a Century, is much more forgiving, let's say. But he's definitely a source of a lot of information about Iraqi Jewish life. In his youth, he was obsessed with sort of passing as a tribesman, so kind of hiding the fact that he came from a family of very affluent businessmen that had different class relationship with the tribe. So in his own accounts and in the accounts of people he knew him, he was very obsessed with passing. So when he was studying at the American University in Beirut, he would dress as like a Bedouin and fool everybody around him. But I think that he's unique because he, unlike many others, didn't believe in this kind of idea that, you know, in order to integrate into society, you can sort of adopt the cultural vision of Islam, but remain faithful to your own faith. And he, you know, converted. And then, you know, he had a different relationship with the state at various points. There's a very interesting novel that is written in Hebrew about his life by Shimon Balas that was translated into English as Outcast. And people have written about that. In terms of where Jews are small minorities or big minority, from my understanding of Mosul, again, there's a variety of groups in the city, but I think the unique thing about Iraq, and this is something that is useful to remember, is that Jews, especially until 48, they're an important minority, but they're not a single minority. There is not a talk about the Jewish problem until very late. If you look at the documents in the 20s and the 30s, people talk about a rural problem, a Shia problem, a Kurdish problem, you know, a literacy problem. Jews as kind of problematized as a group, I think that comes a bit later. But I think that that's important also to understanding their location in Iraqi history, because they're surrounded by other communities who have their own traumas, who have their own histories, who have their own path of success. So, you know, think about the history of the Assyrians and what happened to them in 1933. Think about at the same time, people who benefit from urbanization. So again, I think that the fact that they were minorities surrounded by other minorities and many, many other minorities, this, you know, Iraq has many Christian communities and so forth. We mentioned others. I think this is different. It's definitely different than Europe, where in many places they're the minority, or it is even different from a place like Egypt, where you have, you know, the Copts and then a large population of Muslims and then other Christian Orthodox communities. So we're talking about, you know, numbers are important, but also the comparison. So.
Thank you to the panel for doing an excellent presentation and being on time. Thank you.